Hello. Should I start? Sorry, I'm gonna get a thumbs up. I'm gonna.
Yes, you can go ahead.
Okay, sorry, forgive me. Sorry. So good afternoon, everyone. Really very pleased to welcome you to this webinar hosted by Columbia University's Institute for Global Politics at SIPA. Also very grateful that I was asked to moderate this session. My name is Jonathan Lincoln. I'm a professor of the practice and also director of the Center for Jewish Civilization at Georgetown University's School of Foreign Service. And I also worked for the UN for some 15 years in peacekeeping, political affairs, and development coordination. Truly honored to be online with this distinguished panel with diverse backgrounds on and at the UN. Today we have with us Ambassador Kelly Curry, non-resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Council. She's had a long career in foreign policy and in 2017 was confirmed U.S. representative to ECOSOC, to the United Nations Economic and Social Council. We have Nikolai Mladenov, Director General of the Anwar Gargash Diplomatic Academy in the UAE, former Foreign Minister and Defense Minister of Bulgaria, previously UN Special Coordinator for the Middle East Peace Process in Jerusalem, and UN Special Representative in Iraq, and a Fellow at the Institute. And in full disclosure, my former boss. We also have Ambassador Chris Liu, who is the James R. Schlesinger Distinguished Professor at the University of Virginia's Miller Center. He's had a long career in public service as well and was previously U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations for Management and Reform. And finally, we have Maggie Doherty, Senior Fellow at Harvard Carr Ryan Center for Human Rights, formerly a Senior Policy Advisor to U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations, Nikki Haley. Welcome, everybody. Thank you for your time. Really looking forward to the discussion. We'll start out with just to talk about run of show. We'll start out with some questions to the panel. We'll take a few minutes each to answer, and then we'll open it up to Q&A at the end for the audience. Please use the Q&A function to submit your questions, and of course, I'll do my best to field as many of those in the allotted time. So I'll go ahead and maybe start by briefly setting the scene for the events in New York next week at the high-level portion of the GA, and arguably we're experiencing unprecedented levels of conflict and crisis across the globe. Probably nothing new specifically for this year, but of course this year. As the Secretary General himself has noted, the UN is probably more needed than ever. Yet it's experiencing what is clearly its greatest financial crisis in its 80-year history, and really prompting growing questions about the organization's effectiveness and its relevance. And while I agree with many of the analysts that it's not entirely a result of the shift in U.S. policy, it certainly has a great deal to do with it. In light of all of this, I'll ask the panelists, and we'll start one by one, and maybe we'll start with Kelly. I mean, what do you see as the major issues on the table for next week as world leaders descend on Turtle Bay? Kelly.
Well, thank you, and thank you to SIPA for hosting this important and timely webcast today. I think that the future of the UN really is what's on the agenda and whether it can meet the moment. I think that it certainly has struggled to do so, regardless of who is sitting in the White House. And I think that a lot of the points that the Trump administration has made this time around, and when Maggie and I were up in New York with Ambassador Haley, are really important ones for people in the UN and around the world to hear, that the organization struggles with massive bureaucratic waste and mismanagement, and tries to do too many things in too many places without a clear point of decision or a clear intent behind it, and without the ability and authority to do that. And that especially since the end of the Cold War, the mission and the need for the UN has certainly been very relevant, but it has failed to adapt in a strategic way to really meet that mission and to find its footing really for the past, I would say at this point, 35 years. So we're really in a time of existential crisis for the UN. And the question is whether it will be able to meet that moment, what the new leadership who will follow 10 years of Antonio Gutierrez will look like, and how this storied institution will find its way forward in a very uncertain future.
Thank you. Nikolai, can I turn to you for the same question?
Thank you. Thank you, Jonathan. And let me agree with what Kelly has just said, and maybe point out that I think we're facing a couple of very significant challenges globally. And one is, and to me, that's the primary challenge, is that we live in a world in which more and more leaders believe that they can resolve conflicts through violence than through diplomacy. And unfortunately, that is impacting multilateralism as a whole and the very nature of diplomatic engagement between states. Now, violence has always been one of the ways to resolve conflict, but for the last, more than half a century, I think the world had made a collective effort to try and avoid that as much as possible, and we seem to be losing that consensus now. And perhaps that is one issue that more philosophically needs to be at the core of the debate about the future of the UN. Secondly, I think we're in a period in which we see a growing preference for, well, not a preference, but a return to closed, quiet diplomacy, replacing what we had been used to in the past, which is institutional engagement and more transparency and accountability and diplomatic engagement. So we're seeing more efforts that are actually happening behind closed doors and not as visible as before. Both of these trends, now, if you add on top of that the financial crisis that the UN is facing and the crisis of legitimacy for the whole multilateral space, is creating very, very significant issues that need to be addressed and not to be glazed over in the coming days in the General Assembly and beyond. Because the risk of the UN right now is pretty much the risk that UNIFIL, a mission that Jonathan, both you and I know quite well, faced until now. UNIFIL, the writing had been on the wall that UNIFIL needed to change it, how it did its work for years now. And it was never able to adapt to that. And now we're at a point at which UNIFIL is being shut down at a time when actually both Israel and Lebanon need a mechanism to communicate with each other and to stabilize the situation in the south of Lebanon. And if that mechanism does not come from the UN, it will come from somewhere else. And that's why I think that is pretty much the challenge that the whole organization is facing: adapt to the new realities, or we will be missing something that we've built over the years, but without the toolbox that we need for the future.
No, thanks, Nikolai. And I hope to get back to UNIFIL, because I do agree with you, and I think that that's an important point. And I think it's in some ways indicative of a broader issue on the peace and security file in particular. But Chris, can I turn to you for the broad question?
Great, thank you. I think all of us that have been around the UN have heard that phrase, make the UN fit for purpose. And it's a phrase we've been using for decades. But it's always been a theoretical conversation. We're now actually, the rubber meets the road. When you're looking at US contributions to the UN, just in terms of the regular budget, it's between 22 and 25%. And all of that is at risk right now. And so anyone who runs an organization, when you have to cut potentially 20%, you have to make very tough choices. And that's why it's real right now. I think the challenge is we don't really know where this administration is going to head. Back in February, they ordered a 6-month review of engagement in multilateral organizations. That 6-month ran in August. We still don't know what the recommendations are. I suspect we will hear more when President Trump speaks on Tuesday. And I think a lot of the focus will be about the theatrics, the performative aspects here in New York, and that's all very important. The reality is not just the work that happens here in New York, but the work that happens all around the world in terms of conflict prevention, in terms of development assistance, humanitarian assistance. All of that is being shrunk very dramatically, not just by the U.S. not paying its dues, but really the decimation of U.S. aid, all of that pullback in foreign assistance right now. So there is a crisis existentially here in New York, but there is a growing crisis around the world that's affecting millions of people. And as the US is pulling back, other countries are pulling back as well. So this is really a transitional time. And it really is that moment for the UN to say, here are the things that we must do versus here are the things that are nice to do, but in this climate, we can no longer afford them. The SG has put forward a series of, starting to put forward a series of reform initiatives. Some of them are heading in the right directions, but I think for a lot of us, they're still not aggressive enough for what this moment calls for.
Well, thanks. And I want to go in depth a little bit more on the reform and also on the development issues as well in a bit. But look forward to hearing from Maggie first.
Yeah.
Please, Maggie.
Yeah, and I agree with all of my panelists. And I think in particular, the UN needs to focus on, and the Trump administration has been pushing international peace and security. But to Nikolai's point, the Security Council has not been able to deal with the largest problems because of its composition. While also there was, speaking of reform, Security Council reform proposed, but we also know that's a very, very difficult, almost impossible. And so it's also this problem where we know what the challenge is and we have a solution, but we know that solution won't work. And so I think this administration in its engagement has been focusing on what they've been calling the core roots of the UN, going back to the basics, international security, peace and security. But that's the thing that the Security Council has been failing at the most lately, one could argue. And so it's very interesting that that is where they have put the focus. And then I would also, another point that Nikolai said I want to nail down on, you can tell that this administration enjoys doing things bilaterally. We see that with all of the trade deals, all of these different discussions. And so that's the interesting thing about when this administration engages with the UN. Are they interested in actually having this multilateral forum discussions? Or do they prefer those bilateral discussions where it's the United States versus a smaller country rather than the world against the United States at the United Nations?
Thank you so much. Really a lot to think about already, and probably won't be able to cover all of it in the allotted time. But maybe I'm seeing some sort of interesting consensus here, and I think that there, even across different viewpoints across party lines, if you will. Not I know we're all out of that now, but in some sort of disappointment, I think, with the way that the UN has gone, and really the urgent need to change things. So, Nikolai, you mentioned UNIFIL, and I think that really highlights something well, because I think what we've sort of forgotten in this conversation about UNIFIL, which I fully agree with you, has really not lived up to its expectations, and even arguably, people are using the word useless, especially over the last few years. But what we forget is that in 2006, when it deployed and it scaled up, what the UN is actually good at, it ended the war in 2006, a war that wasn't clear how you were supposed to end, right? People were in a difficulty. Not that justifies, the continuation, but when we look at this, and maybe to bear down on what I'm hearing, and specifically of the SG's reform efforts and UN80 in particular, and Chris, you started this, but is this enough? Is it about reform, or is there something more fundamental about the state of multilateralism today that we need to think about alternative models of cooperation? Maybe Chris, since you raised it, maybe I'll just go to you to start and expand on that a little bit.
I mean, look, I think any of us who have run organizations would say if we had to cut 20% of our budget, cutting it across the board is not the most sensible. It's the easiest, but it's not the most logical way to do it at this point. And I think what the SG has tried to do, at least to lay out a framework, is that the UN has grown over the last 80 years, not necessarily by design. It's just things keep getting bolted on one after another based on new mandates that come from member states. And now is the time to kind of go back to basics. Where can the UN, true to its original mission, provide the biggest impact for the best value? And where can it not do those things, or where can it not do as effectively as other organizations? And so you see that, in the reform proposals, there's a series of streamlining, which is all good, but all should have been done a long time ago. This moment should not have driven some of these things. He's hinted, or he suggested, some potential consolidation and elimination of a couple of agencies. Don't think it's quite as bold as it should be. But I think there needs to just be a broader fundamental understanding in this climate, where should the UN act and where should the UN not act? And it's hard because I have actually sympathy for the SG on this. I mean, he is the chief executive, but ultimately he answers the member states. And no matter how wonderful or inadequate these proposals are, depending on how you look, it still has to go through an exhaustive process, and member states have their own priorities. And that will be the interesting moment to see what the level of US engagement is on that, whether they can bring countries, other big donors like China to the table on this. And frankly, in an environment when the US isn't paying its dues, how much influence have they lost in terms of shaping those debates? And so I suspect we'll continue to see more ambitious reform proposals, but I think the jury's out on how much of this can actually get done.
Thank you, Kelly.
Sorry, thanks. And if I could jump in there, I mean, I think that, look, UNIFIL paused a conflict and froze it in place, essentially didn't actually do anything to address the real underlying problems. Sorry, I mean, this is the reality, and froze Hezbollah as a major political actor in Lebanon in a way that is connected to other events that have taken place across the Middle East in the past couple of years. And I think it's just an example of the kind of weak sauce multilateralism that is often seen as an end to itself rather than, a means to an end. And this is where I think the UN, I mean, everything that Chris said is 100% true. Yes, there are thousands of pointless, redundant, and irrelevant, and frankly, out of so obsolete mandates that have been foisted on the organization, that the GA is like a giant hoarder. They never get rid of anything. It always just sticks around forever and ever, even after it's long outlived its usefulness to anyone. But that's the GA. And I think that, what we've seen is that the UN as an institution has fundamentally failed to deter, prevent, and conflicts in ways that are really evident to everyone who looks at it. And I think that they also have failed at the other mandates of protecting and promoting human rights and frankly promoting development. If you disaggregate China's growth from international development statistics over the past 3 decades, the UN's contribution really is pretty sad. And so I think that we have to be honest. And I think that we've tried over the decades in both Republican and Democrat administrations to push the kinds of reforms that the UN needed. And it was only I'm old enough to remember in the 90s when Congress was like, we're not doing this anymore. And you had Jesse Helms and Madeleine Albright come together and do a grand bargain to get the dues paid, but also to demand some reforms. And those reforms changed, they created some more equitability across payments, but they didn't actually address the fundamental problem of what is the UN for in the post-Cold War world. And in many ways, none of us have really addressed that at home or in the multilateral setting. And some of these institutions are still struggling for meaning. But this is now, it is, as I said before, existential. And the UN is, the Secretary General's cuts are important and helpful, but woefully insufficient unless the GA takes a good hard look. And I used to tell member states all the time, I'm like, look, the United States does not need the UN to function in order for our society to flourish. You actually do need this place to function. So you need to pull back and stop focusing on your precious little thing that's, your little resolution or your little whatever, and look at whether this place can survive without the support of the American people. And why it has lost so much support there's so little interest on Americans who are in charge of foreign policy in supporting so much of what the UN does.
No, great. Thanks, Kelly. Maybe just to come right back. I mean, we can have different understanding of 2006 and look at it either in isolation or in continuity. But your point is really well taken. But is maybe for you and then for Maggie, I mean, is this administration's approach the right one then to achieve ultimately these goals? Is this the right way to proceed?
Nothing else has worked, frankly. I mean, we tried the, tough but firm approach, but kind, Nikki Haley was a nice person who, she was firm, but she wasn't, it wasn't as brutal during the previous Trump administration, but it didn't seem to make much of a dent. And I think that this seems to, just like what's happening with NATO, where the very real threat and people taking that threat seriously has prompted action. Absent Trump doing what he did and this administration doing what they've done in the past 8 months, the Secretary General would never have put forward the UN 80 reforms that he's put forward. And I think we can all acknowledge that. And they would just continue to, just go down the primrose path that they've been going down.
No, thanks for that. And I think maybe the interesting thing is that one of the interesting elements of UN 80 is that this wasn't generated by the member states, right? This is initiative coming from the Secretary General himself. So I think it goes to Chris's point about, what the reaction is going to be, and certainly it's not going to be the last word. But Maggie, please.
Yeah, I would just add that the other thing is the UN is, as we all know, slow. So slow and bureaucratic. So even when you're talking about reforms, and Kelly and I remember this when we were working on Human Rights Council reform, they were like, oh, we have a scheduled session about that in 4 years. And it's like, no, we need it now. We are here to talk to you about reforming. And we did our darndest for an entire year to try to get some sort of reform, and we got nowhere. And so to Kelly's point, is this the perfect approach? I don't know, but people actually start paying attention when the US stops funding. It's just like how Congress and the administration won't listen to Congress until they stop funding. Like, it's just something that makes things move quickly, because in the UN's DNA, moving quickly does not exist.
Okay, Nikolai, I wanted to, because you really were front and center in terms of mediation and conflict resolution, and of course, given your roles in the United Nations in particular, I wanted to, maybe, I think another interesting element of this UN 80 is that it doesn't mention a single country specific or conflict specific issue. But yet, of course, it refers to them, and of course, we understand what we're seeing in places that we work together in Gaza, and of course in Sudan and Ukraine. I mean, and that's not the extent of it, of course, in terms of the crises that the world is facing. But what do you see, in particular in that sort of mediation space? What do you think can be done?
Well, just listening to this discussion, Jonathan, the UN is like the universe. Anything you say about it is probably true, because it is so big, and we somehow need to rein that universe into something that is more practical, and responds to the current needs of the global environment. I mean, let me start a little bit far. I think for the US, there are 3 choices going forward. And whatever you think of the US's role, the US is the major contributor to the United Nations. And it needs to decide whether it leads the debate on how the UN changes, whether it recalibrates its role within the UN, or whether it scales back and leaves others to take up that place. The third option, I don't think, is an option that I would very much welcome, because I think we would lose a lot if we end up in that situation. So I would very much encourage this discussion to actually, push the US to actually take a leading role in the UN reform, because the UN's problem is not bureaucratic, it is political. And yes, you do need to fix the bureaucracy and streamline the system and everything, but the issues are political. And to me, the 3 big issues political are: one is the mediation role, as you've pointed out, of the United Nations and the United Nations Secretariat. Now, that, if you look at the charter, is something that very much depends on the personality of the Secretary General and the team in place. Now, what I'd like to see is, a very strong mediation role by the United Nations in conflicts that may not necessarily be the primary conflicts around the world, but there are plenty of conflicts around the world that need that attention. Because ultimately, member states can step in, they can mediate agreements, but it is the UN that can actually sustain an agreement on the ground, monitor and implement, etc., and do all of that hard work that you know very well indeed. Secondly, I think we need to look at recalibrating the whole idea of peacekeeping. Peacekeeping was developed in a time that the world looked very, very different. The people sitting around the table drafting the UN Charter came from a group of countries, and most of the member states of the world today weren't even independent states when that charter was drafted. So we need to look at how peacekeeping is being reinvented in this environment of today and tomorrow. And there are a lot of issues there related to obsolete mandates. Mandates that go back to 1948, UNSO, an organization that you and I are both very well familiar with, which was set up to monitor the ceasefire between Egypt, Jordan, and Israel. By the way, they happen to have peace treaties, not a ceasefire, since quite a few years, but that mission is still there. There's a lot of obsolete mandates that need to be looked at and new ways of peacekeeping. Thirdly, what I think, we get very much stuck on this issue of Security Council reform and permanent members and vetoes. These are extremely complicated issues to address. Why don't we talk about what can be done in terms of institutional tweaks within the existing system that increase the role of non-permanent member states? For example, instead of having 10, let's have 20. I don't know. I'm just throwing ideas out. Instead of the Security Council selecting the Secretary General, why doesn't the Security Council put 3 names to the General Assembly, and then the General Assembly takes more of an opinion on who should be the next leader of the UN? Look at, a lot of these issues that are within the framework of the Charter, but would actually increase the participation and the engagement. Thirdly, I think, the whole human rights aspect of it. The whole human rights engagement of the United Nations needs to be really thought through. Remember the days when there was a thing called responsibility to protect? Now, those days seem to have completely gone because of all kinds of changes around, geopolitical around the world. But I think we need to reinvent the human rights role of the United Nations that becomes much more, sensitive to what is going on around the world and to the politics of the global environment today. And I think, if we go down that road, we might actually find opportunities where tweaks within the current charter or within how we interpret the current charter may be much more helpful to regaining that legitimacy than either going down just the bureaucratic route or saying, oh no, we need to rewrite the charter. If we're going to rewrite the charter, I assure you, we're not going to come up with anything better than what we have today.
And I just want to jump on some things that Nikolai said, because he is 100% right that these are political problems, and you cannot substitute technical solutions for political problems. And I would point to 3 things that I see happening that are really fundamental political, is that the UN, and including the Secretary General, do not seem to acknowledge that we are in an era of great power competition, that there is a serious great power competition going on, and that the UN is a platform for it and a stage for it and an instrument of it. And that is now fundamental to the character of the UN and is now baked in because people just ignored it for so long. It's now festering inside of it. We also can say that the era of the big peacekeeping mission is over and done with. That will never happen again. We saw the last of it, and it is in the rear view. So I 100% agree with what Nikolai said. Then the other thing that I think the UN really needs, that is fundamental to how the UN operates, and that really aggravates the United States in a substrata way, is that there is a massive anti-democracy bias baked into the way the UN operates, whether it's in the GA or in the Secretariat, where the ability of the UN to put public pressure or to think that they can pressure democracies into doing things, vice authoritarian regimes, and the equalization of treatment between countries that do come in and have to represent a democratic polity, have to respond with democratic accountability to how they spend taxpayer dollars, have to be accountable for the policies that they pursue in the United Nations with their democratic polities. versus authoritarian regimes that come in with zero accountability, zero limits, and a very different mentality about what they're instrumentalizing the UN for. And there are so many structural things about the UN that advantage the authoritarians that are in this space, and are competing for influence and to use the UN for authoritarian political purposes. And this is something that is a very uncomfortable topic for anybody in the Secretariat to talk about. But it's even uncomfortable for the democracies at the UN to talk about. But we need to talk about it, or it's just going to continue to cycle through whatever happens next.
Thank you. There are so many elements there that you've brought up that are going to be great for conversation. But again, I did want to maybe go to well, I'll get back to some of this, but Chris, you recently wrote in Past Blue about what a great piece about what sort of post-U.S. development world or post-U.S. support for the development space, might look like. And also, I think there was a great cover essay in Foreign Policy by Adam Tooze, who's of course at the European Institute at Columbia, who's talking about the end of development, which I think are really good food for thought there on this issue. But when we think about this, I mean, what are the options for other member states who are presumably, as Nikolai was mentioning, looking to the U.S. for that leadership? What are the options? Either rest of the West, so-called, or others. Here specifically, people are talking a lot about the role of China. What are the options? What do you see?
Yeah, I think, look, a lot of the conversations that all of us have been having leading into next week is, can the UN survive without the US? I think unquestionably the answer is yes. It would certainly have to come up with new ways of funding itself. It would have to obviously severely diminish what it does. You would have to find other ways to find consensus. And I think this is what the UN is wrestling with. I mean, we have seen in several significant negotiations over the last 8 months where the US withdrawal has actually led to more clear outcomes, frankly, more aggressive outcomes that some would say are more consistent with what the UN mission is. It is an open question. I think something that we probably should consider. Is that a world in which is that ultimately good for U.S. security? I mean, I think, look, we've had a lot of conversations about how the U.S. can reform the UN. But I think there is this broader conversation about how a strong multilateral system benefits the United States, how the pullback in soft power through, the dismantling of U.S. aid, the elimination of Voice of America, what that does to U.S. influence, particularly in places like Africa, what the bilateral tariff negotiations have done for U.S. influence, the rise of China. The problem I have, and again, it won't surprise you, I disagree with the approach of this administration, is we know who is sitting on the sidelines, and we know that is China. Now, they actually haven't quite stepped to the fore yet with additional money, with a couple of exceptions, WHO being one of them. But we know at the UN, money talks. Money talks in terms of influence, in terms of positions, in terms of your ability to shape the norms. And I fear that a U.S. that is absent from the UN, and I think the UN could survive it, I think leaves a void that China will fill, and we will wake up in 4, 8, or however many years and find a UN that does not look like the one that we in the United States helped shape 80 years ago. I continue to maintain this. We have the greatest home field advantage at the UN. We don't always win, but we win far more often than we lose. And we can have this whole conversation about what the ultimate value of that is. But I do think there is a value, and I think we need to be careful as we push these reform proposals that they need to be reasonable, they need to be aggressive, but there comes a point at which the UN could conceivably walk away, and what that means ultimately for the multilateral system in the US.
Thanks. So Maggie, I mean, is there a danger then to this sort of, throwing the baby out with the bathwater approach potentially here? I mean, and what safeguards do you think should the administration consider not to lose, maybe inadvertently some of the leverage that it has on the world stage?
Yeah, I think one of the things we haven't talked about related to this is something like the UN technical bodies and the UN technical agencies. And that's something that we have seen. AEI, Brett Schaefer put out a report with his recommendations because we haven't seen the administrations yet. But you will notice that the majority of the ones that he focused on are technical. And why is that? Is because those bodies and agencies, even some of it is, tied to laws and treaties and things like that. But even recommendations they put out, the rest of the world will follow. And so one of the things, when I was at the NSC that I would have come to me was private companies begging me to work with the WHO because they're going to set a standard on some medical device that the rest of the world is going to adopt, and the US isn't there to advocate on behalf of US companies. And so that's something that you're going to see across everything. We can list all the technical agencies that we know the administration cares about, but is something, to Kristen's point, where China, other adversaries are just sitting there waiting to say, hey, we can influence the rest of the world to make these decisions that are going to impact the US economy. And that's, separate and distinct from the peace and security. When it comes to US aid, foreign assistance, all of that, I think that, everything that's happened, there's actually an opportunity for the UN in this space, because the US government had people on the ground all over the world, and now they do not, but the UN does. And so the UN, mind you, it's in a bunch of different agencies depending on where and who's in charge of what cluster. That's all crazy, but that's where the streamlining comes in. But that's when, hey, the US isn't going to respond in this remote country because we no longer have the capability to, but the UN does, and the US could still put money towards that. So there are these opportunities that will be there, but I think it is important, to Kelly's earlier point, the rest of the world cares what goes on in the UN every day. And so even if the US puts minimal effort towards that, we're able, to Chris's point, home field advantage, influence it to a way that advantages the United States in the end.
No, thanks so much.
Jonathan, can I just jump in on
Please,
Maggie's point? Because
please,
this is so good on the technical bodies.
Yes, okay, because that's what one of the questions also
think
in
about this.
So that's great that we're doing
the
that.
norms
Please.
and standards for AI will be decided by ITU and by UNESCO. And the US leads in AI development and deployment. We cannot be absent from these bodies. And it is one of the reasons why this administration is supporting the re-election of an American, Dorian Bogdan-Martin, to head ITU. So it is the question. We can't completely disengage, but can we cherry pick where we engage and don't engage? I don't know the answer to that question, but it is. I don't think complete disengagement is a viable strategy for U.S. national security.
But that ITU predates the UN. It existed before the UN, and it could exist independently of the United Nations. And I actually believe that we should be looking at more bespoke solutions instead of trying to tie everything into some grand global scheme where we end up with a lot of what I call globaloney and not a lot of actual activity that matters to normal people. So I think that, I believe that I don't believe in complete disengagement. Please don't misunderstand me. And I don't think anybody is advocating that. Maggie knows how much Donald Trump loves going to high-level week. It's like homecoming for him. He loves it, and he's the prom queen. So he loves the high-level week. So I don't think we'll ever walk away completely, but I think that there is absolutely a way to use our engagement in a much smarter, more strategic way, and frankly learn from how the Chinese have leveraged their lack of actual monetary contributions and other power politics to get their way in these bodies without paying for anything. I mean, they literally pay for nothing. Even though they are the second largest, mandated contribution, but their voluntary contributions are negligible. And so we can absolutely use our voluntary contributions to much more targeted and greater effect, to actually drive and show that there are parts of the UN or parts of the multilateral system that can work and be effective with American leadership and engagement, while putting less resources, frankly, into the parts that are pretty much hopeless and are not going to, and are just, where we just need to be playing defense.
Jonathan,
Thank you
if
so
I
much.
can jump
Yeah,
in very
go ahead,
briefly
Nikolai.
here.
And I have a
I
specific
don't
question for you too, but if you want to go in on the technical stuff too,
Just
please.
very briefly, I think, we don't need a one size fits all for
Yeah.
multilateralism. I mean, we're clearly in a period in which I think, as Kelly said, that, there is global power competition, but there is also another thing happening, and that is sort of mini-lateral arrangements popping up here and there around the world that are quite unique to the stage of international relations. And we need to recognize that perhaps for some problems, that is a better way of addressing them than always trying to put them into sort of a global context. For other problems, of course, a global context is necessary. I mean, we can't deal with climate change unless we get everybody sitting around the table and contributing actively and figuring out what to do with it. But for example, dealing with a pandemic. But how we deal with specific other issues, mini-lateralism might be a better way to go forward. And therefore, I don't think, and this, going back to what I had said earlier, I think that's why the US needs to lead this debate. Because if the US recalibrates how it engages with the United Nations, that's not necessarily bad. That is actually opening up opportunities for other countries to come in and to engage as well. If the US decides to scale back and open up the space for others to take it over, that's a whole different story. So therefore, I think there's a lot, in this conversation that can be, we can focus on further.
No, thanks, Nikolai. And that's a really good setup, because what I wanted to ask you in some ways, and again, I'm sort of a strange animal myself. I mean, not that there aren't that many of us, but a U.S. citizen, but of course, 15 years a UN staff member. What do you think? And we've just had this interesting discussion and this back and forth, not really as much disagreement as you might think, but some important points of disagreement between Kelly, Chris, and Maggie. What do you think Americans don't sort of misunderstand, maybe, or not really misunderstand, but don't really get about the importance of the UN in other places? And here specifically, I'm just thinking about the discussions on again, it's to open up a can of worms here, but thinking about day after discussions taking place, what we've heard in the press about day after in Gaza, and Tony Blair's involvement and everything like that. Front and center in that is, of course, a UN Security Council resolution of some sort, and the UN's role is highlighted prominently. I'm not necessarily suggesting that the US would think that the UN Security Council shouldn't be involved, but it's highlighted very, very prominently. And of course, when we heard earlier statements by the UAE in particular about what their role in the future of Gaza might be, the role of the UN, not necessarily in the lead, not to take over necessarily, but it was extremely important. This is sort of what I'm thinking about. Nikolai, from your perspective, what do you think is important for an American audience to understand about how the rest of the world looks at the UN?
Do we have an extra hour for that discussion? Because we're certainly not going to wrap it up within the time limit of this discussion. I think Americans need to understand that the United Nations is, one, a forum where the whole world can come together and discuss issues openly and diplomatically rather than fight over them physically. And I think that is a very, very important asset to have on the global table, and to, perhaps even more important for America if it's in New York. Secondly, I think it also needs to understand that the United Nations allows the US to project power as part of its whole foreign policy, toolbox. If it is able to achieve, agreements and consensus, etc. And thirdly, I think Americans need to understand that actually the UN can, if it is, I think, streamlined and reformed and fit for purpose, as was said earlier, actually serve America's own interest in reducing conflicts around the world and sustaining arrangements when they're put in place. It doesn't mean that the UN is this sort of magical toolbox that you throw at every problem around the world. No, that doesn't work, and we've clearly seen that happen. But it includes a lot of instruments that can be actually very useful for the United Nations. Now, your Gaza question is a whole different world. I would have really, really liked to see a situation in which actually the UN was leading the discussions on the future of Gaza after the operation, but I fully understand why that is not the case. And I don't want to get down the road of why we should argue about that. But I think where the UN now needs to step up is really, both in its relationship with Israel, which is critical to be able to serve the Palestinian people in a good way. Secondly, to really address the major challenges that UNRWA has faced over the years, and challenges that you and I are very, very well aware of. And thirdly, actually focus on what it can do right now, which is provide aid to the people of Gaza, humanitarian aid as much as possible, as quickly as possible, and deal with these issues first. Before everything else. Now, that is a very complicated discussion, and I think we need to look at what other countries can do, the Arab countries, the United Arab Emirates, Saudi Arabia, others in the region. And you talked about the UAE role, which is actually the biggest bilateral donor now for Gaza, but also that role is being very much challenged in the sort of the Israeli political context of potential annexation of the West Bank. Now that all of these issues are sort of little blocks that can be turned into also opportunities to build actually a situation in which you have a framework for Gaza that is meaningful, that provides hope for people for the future, that addresses Israel's security concerns, that changes the system of, not just education, but the whole system of how Gaza is run so that radicalism can't thrive in that environment, and that it also meets the aspirations of the Palestinian people. But I don't want to go down that rabbit hole because it would be an endless discussion.
No, thanks so much, Nikolai. And I mean, and I can see Kelly wants to come in, so I'm going to go to you next. But just to even add, isn't this an argument? And I know you're going to disagree with me, but isn't this more of an argument for why the United States should be more engaged in these debates, about the future of UNRWA and other things, related specifically to this particular issue?
On the three biggest national security and foreign policy issues that the United States is wrestling with right now, the UN is either a problem to be managed or irrelevant. Ukraine, UN, you've got another member of a Security Council attacking a sovereign independent country, and the UN has done almost nothing about it. Zero, zippy. Number two, you just talked about Gaza and the Israeli conflict in Gaza. UNRWA, really? I'm sorry, no. The UN and UNRWA and have lost all credibility with the Israeli people and the Israeli government. That's just, and frankly, with the American policy community as well. And then number three would be a conflict with China over Taiwan, which is really what's driving US national security policy at the moment. And you can't even say the word Taiwan in the UN. People from Taiwan can't even go on a tour of the UN building because of China's ability to shut down any possible conversation of that. So if you're talking about what is of concern to the American people, I don't really see the UN. The UN does not contribute to American peace and security in a way that is meaningful to the average American, and in fact feels like a point of vulnerability to people who really kind of understand things about this, and it's certainly to this administration. So I think that there's a lot of damage that's been done and repair that's going to need to be done. And I'll stop there because I know we want to take some questions.
No, thank you. That's great. Nikolai,
please briefly say a couple of words. I fully agree with Kelly on these issues, on Ukraine, on Gaza, on everything you've mentioned. But I still feel that where the UN doesn't get enough credit is what it can do, where you have other conflicts around the world that potentially can explode and become bigger issues. And part of the role of such a multilateral organization in its mediating capacity should be to do preventive diplomacy, so that not everything becomes a Ukraine or a Gaza like scenario around the world. And there, I think, is where we need to focus.
Can I just jump in? Because I think both of these points are important. I think I might disagree on what the three major conflicts are, but I think it's become very clear, in part, and we need to admit, because of the makeup of the Security Council and the fact that we hold one of the vetoes as well, is that the UN in this environment cannot act when one of the P5 is involved in the conflict. It just cannot. And so, but I think Nikolai's 100% correct, where in these other conflicts around the world where it is not part of any country's sphere of influence, it is still doing critical work. Now, the question is should we have these peacekeeping missions in Africa that are going billion-dollar peacekeeping missions that have gone on for 30 years? So I think it has the potential in limited places, but it all goes back to this concept of Security Council reform, where, you know, we as the U.S. Have tried to shape this debate, but we have our own equities in this as well. So, and it's hard to imagine that moving forward in this current climate as well.
Thanks. Maggie, did you want to come in on this?
I have all the thoughts, but let's get to questions.
Okay, so I mean, we've been so many of these questions, and again, to the audience, please do submit your questions to the Q&A function. A lot of them already, and we have quite a few already from before and in the chat. But please do send. I think a lot of them have been answered in some respect, but I'll pick up a few, and then again, apologies if we don't get to all of them. But maybe for the panel, can you provide examples of breakthroughs in UN projects in terms of poverty outreach, cost effectiveness, and agility, and local control? In other words, you know, we talked about this a little bit, but are there specific elements that you think that the UN is doing well, and that they should be highlighted? Maybe, I don't know, Chris or Maggie or anybody want to take that?
I mean, look, you know, over the course of 80 years, you know, I think 1 billion people have been taken out of poverty. It's the gains in, you know, malaria, in terms of public health, in terms of education. I mean, the list goes across the board. And I think the challenge is, and yes, it's not just the UN, it's the UN operating in connection with organizations like USAID and other development assistance around the world. But the UN is a powerful force on the ground, as Maggie said. I mean, they are often the first people there when there's a humanitarian crisis. They have the people that are embedded there. Now, we can have this whole broader conversation about whether we've done enough in terms of creating self-sufficiency in these countries. But unquestionably, the UN has done far more good than bad. The question is there more that they can do if they are more focused in these efforts? And I think that we would all agree, yes.
Kelly, please.
I mean, international civil aviation is safer because the UN is, because there's a UN body that helps to manage airspace control. It's really, I think that it's hard to disaggregate what the UN has done when it comes to development versus what just governments getting out of the way of their citizens by abandoning statist and communist ideologies that destroyed their economies and the animal spirits of their people. So that really is I think the biggest driver of poverty alleviation over the past 50 years, far more so than anything the UN has done. Yes, they're working on early. I think that if you look at UNICEF and some of the early childhood disease and vaccination efforts, those are things you can point to, but a lot of that is American leadership and the use of American resources to go out, and that's where it works because there is American leadership working within a framework. But I think that you have to think pretty small in some ways to see the result. And again, I think that if you look at whether you're just alleviating a childhood disease so that a child can then just grow up in a really terrible, badly governed, poor country where nothing structural changes, obviously every life is precious, but you're not addressing the structural problem if you're just dealing with the band-aids of childhood vaccinations and early childhood education.
So to that, and I see there's a request in the chat for a part 2, maybe a more development focused part 2 of this conversation, which of course I would be pleased to engage in. But then, I mean, thinking about this in terms of the U.S. stepping back then from multilateral leadership. The question here in the chat is, could it actually be positive for the world if China steps up to fill that role and perhaps becomes the new global leader, or does the panel see major downsides?
Well, without the US stepping back from the UN, China is already taking up a very strong position on, within its, sphere in terms of development assistance, etc. I mean, it's been much extremely active in Africa and now with in other parts of the world. But I think, listening to the question which you asked before, I think there are a number of good examples that can be shown of what the UN has actually done. Where I think my criticism would be is that on the peace building mediation role is where we see a lot of the visible failings. I mean, one positive example in that is, and I'm sure you remember this situation in South Sudan, where the UN opened its gates to save people from being massacred years ago. Unfortunately, it didn't do that in Rwanda, and neither did it do it in Srebrenica. So, we have to look at why that is the case, and what can be done to sort of strengthen these situations. It may be just my bias towards the mediating role of the UN, but I think that's where I think also a lot of the public image of the organization comes from. And if we want to restore the credibility of the organization and rebuild its support around the world, that's where we need to see some visible successes. And there are plenty of opportunities right now in the world where you have conflicts, whether it's the Sudan or elsewhere, where you have massive issues that need to be dealt with, again, with US engagement, but also with a multilateral framework around it.
So, yeah, Maggie, did you want to come in?
Yeah, I would just on the China question, like
Yes,
full
please.
stop. We would always joke, and I probably stole this from Kelly, China is always like win-win for China and lose-lose for the rest of the world. And that is what they do at the UN. They play the game where they say they're a developed country, they work the G77. You'll be surprised the amount of money that goes for development in China that the UN spends. It's incredible. And so it really, they're only out for themselves. And when it comes to the UN context, so if they're able to do that, influence would be bad. And then I would just say the other interesting thing that is hard for the UN to operate, can be a plus, but also a negative, is to Nikolai's point, they need host country consent to operate. And so that's when the UN gets into these trouble, is because they do not want to anger the government, authoritarian, or terrorist group that they're working with in order to be there. And that is when they make those decisions that can be life or death for people.
Great. No, thank you so much. And thank you to the panel. I know we have a hard stop in about 15 seconds. I just want to say this does raise the big issue, of course, of how much of this is UN failure versus member state failure, not necessarily that it's a question of excusing the UN or some of the problems. I think it also opens up another huge question that, of course, we didn't talk about, which is who speaks for the UN. We have so many different entities, so many different agencies, programs, human rights organizations, international justice mechanisms, etc. Thank you so much to everybody for this incredibly rich and I thought fascinating discussion. We scratched the surface really of all of these issues, but I look forward to potentially a part two, but certainly continuing the conversation. Thank you also to Columbia University for putting this on. Thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks.